Hi folks, welcome to News from the Rebellion, the podcast where we take a look at the newspapers from the North and the South during the time of the Civil War. Each episode will focus on an event either leading up to the Civil War or during the Civil War, and then we'll see what the newspapers had to say about that event from the northern point of view in a northern newspaper and from the southern point of view in a southern newspaper. In today's episode, we'll take a look at how the papers portrayed the passage of the Massachusetts troops through Baltimore in April of '61. Have a listen.
The Baltimore Sun, Baltimore, Maryland, April 20th, 1861. Transit of Massachusetts volunteers and other troops through Baltimore. Their passage interrupted, railroad track barricaded, passage of several cars. Citizens of Baltimore shot down in our streets. Massachusetts volunteers killed and wounded. Immense rally of citizens on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The soldiers stopped calling out of city military. The railroads declined to pass any more northern troops. Scenes and incidents, etc., meeting in Monument Square. Yesterday morning, the excitement which had been gradually rising in this city for some days with reference to the passage of Northern volunteer troops southward reached its climax upon the arrival of the Massachusetts and other volunteers, some from Philadelphia, at President Street Depot at 10:30. A large crowd had assembled, evidently to give them an unwelcome reception. The arrangements contemplated the passage of 31 cars occupied by the volunteers, from President Street Depot to the Camden station of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, over the intervening space occupied by the Pratt Street track. The cars were dispatched one after the other by horses, and upon the arrival of the first car at the intersection of Gay and Pratt Streets, a vast assemblage having collected there, demonstrations were made which evidently contemplated the stopping of the troops at that point. Just there, repairs of the road were in progress, and a number of paving stones were lying in heaps which were seized by the crowd and used for purposes of assault. 6 of the cars had succeeded in passing on their way before the crowd were able to accomplish their purpose of barricading the track, which they now began to effect by placing large heavy anchors lying in the vicinity directly across the rails. Some 7 or 8 were borne by the crowd and laid on the track, and thus the passage of the cars was effectually interrupted. Having accomplished this object, the crowd set to lustily cheering for the South, for Jefferson Davis, South Carolina, and secession, and groans for sundry obnoxious parties. In the meanwhile, the troops thus delayed at the depot remained quietly in the cars until tired of their inaction, and apprehending a more formidable demonstration, they came to the conclusion to face the music and march through the city. They accordingly evacuated the cars and rapidly gathering on the street north of the depot, formed in line and prepared to make the attempt. The word was given to march, and the head of the line had advanced some 15 paces, when it was driven back upon the main body by the immense crowd still further increased by a body of men who marched down to the depot, bearing at their head a Confederate flag. The riot, 8 of the cars started from the President Street Depot and 6 passed safely to the Camden station. The other 2 soon returned, the track in the meantime having been obstructed at the corner of Pratt and Gay Streets by anchors, paving stones, sand, etc., being put on it by the crowd. Attempts had previously been made to tear up the track, but the police, by strenuous effort, prevented this. A cartload of sand which was being driven along was seized and thrown upon the track. The bridge across Jones's Falls on Pratt Street was also soon after barricaded with boards, and so on, which were being used previously by workmen in repairing it. After considerable delay, it was determined to make the attempt to march the remaining troops through the city, only about 60 of whom were supplied with arms. The remainder were recruits, and occupied second-class and baggage cars. At the head of this column, on foot, Mayor Brown placed himself and walked in front, exerting all his influence to preserve peace. Just before the movement was made from the cars, a large crowd of persons went down President Street with a Southern flag and met the troops as they emerged from the cars. The Southern flag was then carried in front of the column, and hooting and yelling began, and as soon as the troops turned out of Canton Avenue, they were greeted with a volley of stones. At the corner of Fawn Street, 2 of the soldiers were struck with stones and knocked down. One of them was taken by the police to the drugstore of T.J. Pitt at the corner of Pratt and High Streets, and the other to the Eastern Police Station. The yelling continued and the stones flew thick and fast. At Pratt Street Bridge, a gun was fired, said by policeman number 71 to have been fired from the ranks of the soldiers. Then the crowd pressed stronger until the body reached the corner of Gay Street, where the troops presented arms and fired. Several persons fell on the first round, and the crowd became furious. A number of revolvers were used, and their shots took effect in the ranks. People then ran in every direction in search of arms, but the armories of the military companies of the city were closely guarded, and none could be obtained. The firing continued from Frederick Street to South Street in quick succession, but how many fell cannot now be ascertained. Among those wounded was a young man named Francis X. Ward, who resides at the corner of Baltimore and Asquith Streets. He was shot in the groin, but the wound is not thought to be mortal. A young man named James Clark, formerly connected with No. 1 Hook and Ladder Company, was shot through the head and instantly killed. James Myers, residing on Fayette Street, was shot in the right side of the back, near the spine, and the ball, a Mini, passed through him and lodged among the false ribs. He was mortally wounded. John McCann of No. 2 North Bond Street was mortally wounded. A man named Flannery, residing on Frederick Street, near Pratt, was mortally wounded and died shortly after. Mr. Carr, residing at the corner of Exeter and Bank Streets, was wounded by a musket ball in the knee. The wound is severe. John Staub, clerk with Tucker and Smith on Charles Street, was shot in the forefinger of the right hand. A young man named Maloney was shot on Pratt Street near Gay and died at the Central Police Station. James Keenan was wounded by having a Mini ball pass through his body. He was one of the stranger soldiers. His wound was supposed to be mortal. He was taken to the office of Dr. Hintz, where he received surgical attendance and was then taken to the Protestant infirmary. At the police station, an old man, who did not give his name, was badly wounded. How many were wounded, it was impossible to ascertain, as many of the soldiers who left on the cars were known to have been injured. Kirk Hatch of Philadelphia was wounded on the head by a blow from a stone or bludgeon. He was severely injured. Mr. Connor of Baltimore was also wounded on the head with a stone and was taken to his residence on Bond Street. At the Central Police Station, 2 soldiers were taken in dead, as also 2 citizens. 3 soldiers and 1 citizen were taken to the same place wounded. The crowd passed on up Pratt Street, and near Light Street there was another volley fired. At Light Street Wharf, a boy named William Reed, a hand on board the oyster sloop Wild Pigeon of York County, Virginia, received a ball through the abdomen and was dying, at last accounts, in the hold of the schooner. Another boy, Patrick Griffin, employed at the greenhouse, Pratt Street, was shot through the bowels while looking from the door. A frenzied crowd returned the fire from revolvers and with bricks. Andrew Robbins, a member of a volunteer company from Stonington, Connecticut, was shot in the back of the head and fell from the ranks. He was taken into the drugstore of Jesse S. Hunt's, corner of Pratt and Charles Street. His wound is dangerous. Another soldier, S. H. Needham, a member of the Massachusetts Regiment, was struck by a brick and knocked insensible from the ranks. He was taken into the bookstore of T. N. Kurtz, 181 Pratt Street. He subsequently died. Professor J. W. R. Dunbar was very active in rendering assistance to the wounded, as were also other physicians. The firing on the citizens at Howard and Dover Streets. At the corner of Howard and Dover Streets, one of the marching companies was pressed upon, when the troops in one of the cars fired a volley into the citizens. The balls struck in the brick walls of the dwelling, dashing out pieces of brick and making large holes in the walls. The fire was returned from several points with guns and revolvers, and with bricks by the crowd. Several soldiers were wounded here, but it is thought no citizens were struck by the bullets of the soldiers. The faces of many of the soldiers, as seen through the car windows, were streaming with blood from cuts received from the shattered glass of car windows and from the missiles hurled into them. Several wounded, supposed to have been shot in their passage along Pratt Street, were taken out of the car in a bleeding and fainting condition at the Camden station and transferred to the other cars. From Gay to South Street on Pratt, the fight with the soldiers who marched or rather ran through town was terrific. Large paving stones were hurled into the ranks from every direction, the Negroes who were about the wharf, in many instances, joining in the assault. At Gay Street, the soldiers fired a number of shots, though without hitting anyone, so far as could be ascertained. After firing this volley, the soldiers again broke into a run, but another shower of stones being hurled into the ranks at Commerce Street with such force as to knock several of them down, the order was given to another portion of them to halt and fire, which had to be repeated before they could be brought to a halt. They then wheeled and fired some 20 shots, but from their stooping and dodging to avoid the stones, but 4 or 5 shots took effect, the marks of a greater portion of their balls being visible on the walls of the adjacent warehouses, even up to the second stories. Here 4 citizens fell, 2 of whom died in a few moments, and the other 2 were carried off, supposed to be mortally wounded. As one of the soldiers fired, he was struck with a stone and knocked down, and as he attempted to arise, another stone struck him in the face, when he crawled into a store and, prostrating himself on the floor, clasped his hands and begged piteously for his life, saying that he was threatened with instant death by his officers if he refused to accompany them. He said one half of them had been forced to come in the same manner, and he hoped all who forced others to come might be killed before they got through the city. He pleaded so hard that no further vengeance was bestowed upon him, and he was taken to the police station to have his wounds dressed. As soon as they had fired at this point, they again wheeled and started off in a full run, when some 3 or 4 parties issued from the warehouses there and fired into them, which brought down 3 more soldiers, one of whom was carried into the same store with the one above alluded to and died in a few moments. The others succeeded in regaining their feet and proceeded on with their comrades, the whole running as fast as they could, and a running fire was kept up by the soldiers from this point to the depot, the crowd continuing to hurl stones into the ranks throughout the whole line of march. The troops reached the Camden Railroad Station. As early as 9 o'clock, throngs collected about the Camden Station in anticipation of the arrival of the troops from the President Street Depot. The throngs gradually augmented until about 10:30 o'clock, when a large body of police appeared, and the mass took it for granted that the troops were coming. Meanwhile, the assembly kept itself informed on events at the lower depot by several young men on horseback who rode rapidly forward and back between the depots. The mayor of the city and the Board of Police Commissioners did their utmost to pacify the crowd, as well as did other prominent citizens. Finally, crowds rushing pell-mell from the lower streets towards the depot gave notice that the cars were coming, and they arrived one after another, drawn by 4 horses. The blinds of most of the cars were shut down, and in those not provided with blinds, the troops laid down flat to avoid the bricks thrown at them. The car windows were perfectly riddled, and their sides bore great indentations from the rocks and bricks hurled at them. The scene while the troops were changing cars was indescribably fearful. Taunts clothed in the most fearful language were hurled at them by the panting crowd, who, almost breathless with running, pressed up to the car windows presenting knives and revolvers and cursed up into the faces of the soldiers. The police were thrown in between the cars, and forming a barrier, the troops changed cars, many of them cocking their muskets as they stepped on the platform. After embarking, the assemblage expected to see the train move off, but its departure was evidently delayed in the vain hope that the crowd would disperse. But no, it swelled, and the troops expressed to the officers of the road their determination to go at once, or they would leave the cars and make their way to Washington. While the delay was increasing the excitement, a wild cry was raised on the platform, and a dense crowd ran down the platform and out the railroad track towards the Spring Gardens, until the track for a mile was black with an excited, rushing mass. The crowd, as it went, placed obstructions of every description on the track. Great logs and telegraph poles requiring a dozen or more men to move them were laid across the rails, and stones rolled from the embankment. A body of police followed after the crowd, both in a full run, and removed the obstructions as fast as they were placed on the track. Various attempts were made to tear up the track with logs of wood and pieces of timber, and there was a great outcry for pickaxes and handspikes, but only 1 or 2 could be found. The police interfered on every occasion, but the crowd, growing large and more excited, would dash off into a breakneck run for another position further on until the county line was reached. The police followed, running until forced to stop from exhaustion. At this point, many of the throng gave it up from exhaustion, but a crowd, longer-winded, dashed on for nearly a mile further, now and then pausing to attempt to force the rails or place some obstruction upon them. They could be distinctly seen for a mile along the track where it makes a bend at the Washington Road Bridge. When the train went out, the mass of people had mostly returned to the depot. Shots and stones were exchanged between the military and citizens at several points, with the result detailed elsewhere, correspondence, etc. The following is the correspondence of the authorities with the railroad officials and President Lincoln on the subject of stopping the passage of troops. Mayor's Office, City Hall, Baltimore, April 19, 1861. John W. Garrett, Esquire, President Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Sir, we advise that the troops now here be sent back to the borders of Maryland. Respectfully, signed, Thomas H. Hicks, George W. Brown, by order of the Board of Police. Signed, Chase Howard, President of Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, President's Office, Baltimore, April 19th. To His Excellency Theodore H. Hicks, Governor, His Honorable G. W. Brown, Mayor of Baltimore, Chase Howard, Esquire, President Board of Police Commissioners. Gentlemen, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication of this date, in which you advise that the troops now here be sent back to the borders of Maryland. Most cordially approving this advice, I have instantly telegraphed the same to the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad Company, and this company will act in accordance therewith. Your obedient servant, signed, J. W. Garrett, President. Mayor's Office, Baltimore, April 19, 1861. To His Excellency the President of the United States. Sir, a collision between the citizens and the Northern troops has taken place in Baltimore, and the excitement is fearful. Send no troops here. We will endeavor to prevent all bloodshed. A public meeting of citizens has been called, and the troops of the state and the city have been called out to preserve the peace. They will be enough. Signed, Theodore H. Hicks, George William Brown, Mayor. We are advised that William Prescott Smith, Esquire, besides sending the foregoing by telegraph, sent a special engine ahead of all trains down to Washington, so that there might be no doubt of Mr. Lincoln's receiving it at the earliest moment. The Baltimore directors of the Northern Central Railroad, who constitute only a minority of the board, held a meeting last evening and made a formal protest against the conveyance of any more troops from the north over the road. The Baltimore and Ohio Company sent an official communication to the Northern Central Company informing them that they would pass no more troops to Washington that should reach the city by that route. A dispatch was received from Mr. Felton, president of the Philadelphia Road, in response to the recommendations from here, saying that he would send no more troops over his road at present, and requesting the officers in this city to confer with proper parties on the subject. The order to the military. The following order was, at 2 p.m. yesterday, sent to us for publication in the Sun, and as the earliest mode of presenting it to the public was included in the contents of the Sun Extra Division Orders, 1st Light Division, Maryland Volunteers, Baltimore, 19th April, 1861. In obedience to the order of His Excellency Governor Hicks, the 1st Light Division will parade forthwith in North Calvert Street, provided with ball cartridges, to suppress the insurrection and riot going on in the streets of this city and to preserve good order and quiet. By order of Major General Stewart, James H. Stewart, Acting Aide. Incidents of the battle. While the cars containing the troops were standing at the President Street Depot, a clerk from the Custom House went into one of them and denounced the soldiers in bitter terms. A captain ordered him out, threatening if he did not go, they would fire on him. He replied they were too cowardly to fire when the officer struck at him with his sword, which blow he received on the left hand, and with the other knocked him down and took his sword from him, as also the scabbard. A private interfered for the protection of his commander, and he too the clerk knocked down with a heavy-drawn pistol, and escaped with his prize, the sword, the only injury he received being a pretty severe cut across his hand. At the intersection of Gay and Pratt Streets, while the soldiers were firing upon the crowd, 2 other clerks from the same place ran into the ranks, and each knocking down a soldier with his fists bore off their muskets as trophies of their exploit. The young man shot in the leg and taken to the infirmary, and attended by Dr. Morris appeared quite grateful for the humane attention shown him. When asked why he came, the simple and unsophisticated reply of the youth was, "Oh, the flag, the stars and stripes. It was expected that the wounded leg would have to be amputated last night. He is only about 18 years old, and may he live to grow wiser as he grows older." Another of those in the station house said he had no enmity against the South, and came only because his company was ordered out. Otherwise, he would have been jeered as a coward and recreant. Others in the companies were actuated by the same motives. A body of 105 of the volunteers from the North was taken in charge by the police of the Eastern District and sent back. They are now said to have stopped at Magnolia. At the Eastern Police Station last night, a German asked for lodging. He said he had been forced into the cars at Philadelphia, but did not know where they were going to take him. The run to Washington. The military train, in its run to Washington, was stopped at the Jackson Bridge near Chinquapin Hill by the removal of several rails. They disembarked and the rails were relaid under the protection of the troops. An occasional shot was fired at the troops from the hills and woods along the route, but the range was too long for any effect. Suspension of business. Closing of stores. As the riot progressed along Pratt Street, all the stores on that thoroughfare were closed. Many of the stores on Baltimore and other business streets were also closed. The utmost alarm and distress was manifested on the part of some females and children, many of whom ran crying through the streets, apprehensive for the safety of relatives and friends. Arrests. A great number of arrests of parties throwing bricks and missiles at the troops were made by the police. The magistrate imposed the usual fine under the ordinance prohibiting the throwing of missiles in the streets.
The New York Herald. New York, New York, April the 28th, 1861. Important from Maryland. Meeting of the Legislature. Special message of Governor Hicks. Important action of the Senate. Baltimore, April 27th, 1861. Gentlemen of the Senate and House of Representatives. The extraordinary condition of affairs in Maryland has induced me to exercise the constitutional prerogative vested in the governor, to summon the legislature in special session, in the hope that your wisdom may enable you to devise prompt and effective means to restore peace and safety to our state. I shall detail briefly the starting events which have induced me to summon you together, and which have so suddenly placed us in the state of anarchy, confusion, and danger, from which I sincerely trust you may be able to extricate us. Believing it to be the design of the administration to pass over our soiled troops for the defense of the city of Washington, and fearing that the passage of such troops would excite our people and provoke a collision, I labored earnestly to induce the President to forego his purpose. I waited upon him in person and urged the importance of my request. I subsequently communicated with him and his cabinet by special dispatches, entreating an abandonment of his designs. To all my requests I could get but the reply that Washington was threatened with attack, that the government had resolved to defend it, that there was no other way of obtaining troops other than passing them over the soil of Maryland, and that the military necessity of the case rendered it impossible for the government to abandon its plans, much as it desired to avoid the dangers of a collision. My correspondence with the authorities at Washington is therewith submitted. The consequences are known to you. On Friday last, a detachment of troops from Massachusetts reached Baltimore and was attacked by an irresponsible mob, and several persons on both sides were killed. The mayor and police board gave to the Massachusetts soldiers all the protection they could afford, acting with the utmost promptness and bravery. But they were powerless to restrain the mob. Being in Baltimore at the time, I cooperated with the mayor to the fullest extent of my power in his efforts. The military of the city were ordered out to assist in the preservation of the peace. The railroad companies were requested by the mayor and myself to transport no more troops to Baltimore City, and they promptly acceded to our request. Hearing of the attack upon the soldiers, the War Department issued orders that no more troops would pass through Baltimore City provided they were allowed to pass outside its limits. Subsequently, a detachment of troops were ascertained to be encamped at or near Cockeysville in Balsam County. On being informed of this, the War Department ordered them back. Before leaving Baltimore, Colonel Huger, who was in command of the United States Arsenal at Pikesville, informed me that he had resigned his commission. Being advised of the probability that the mob might attempt the destruction of this property, and thereby complicated our difficulties with the authorities at Washington, I ordered Colonel Petherbridge to proceed with sufficient force and occupy the premises in the name of the United States government, of which proceeding I immediately notified the War Department. On Sunday morning, last I discovered that a detachment of troops under command of Brigadier General Benjamin F. Butler had reached Annapolis in a steamer and had taken possession of the practice ship Constitution, which during that day they succeeded in getting outside the harbor of Annapolis, where she now lies. After getting the ship off, the steamer laid outside the harbor and was soon joined by another steamer having on board the 7th Regiment from New York City. Brigadier General Butler addressed me, asking for permission to land his forces. It will be seen from the correspondence herewith submitted that I refused consent. The mayor of Annapolis also protested, but both steamers soon afterwards landed and put off with the troops. Subsequently, other large bodies of troops reached here in transports and were landed. I was notified that the troops were to be marched to Washington. They desired to go without obstructions from our people, but they had orders to go to Washington and were determined to obey those orders. In furtherance of their designs, they took military possession of Annapolis and Elk Ridge Railroad, in regard to which act I forwarded to Brigadier General Butler the protest, and see the reply herewith submitted. On Wednesday morning, the WO detachments landed and took up the line of march for Washington. The people of Annapolis, though greatly exasperated, acting under counsel of the most prudent citizens, refrained from molesting or obstructing the passage of the troops through the city. Seriously impressed with the condition of affairs and anxious to avoid a repetition of events similar to those which had transpired in Baltimore, I deemed it my duty to make another appeal at Washington. Accordingly, I sent a special messenger to Washington with a dispatch to the administration, advising that no more troops be sent through Maryland, that the troops at Annapolis be sent elsewhere, and urging that a truce be offered with a view of a peaceful settlement of existing difficulties by mediation. I suggested that Lord Lyons, the British minister, be requested to act as mediator between the contending parties. The result of the mission will be seen from the correspondence herewith submitted. These events have satisfied me that the War Department has concluded to make Annapolis the point for landing troops, and has resolved to open and maintain communication between this place and Washington. In the brief time allowed, it is impossible for me to go more into detail. The documents accompanying this message places before you all the information possessed by me. I shall promptly communicate such other information as may reach me. Notwithstanding the fact, our most learned and intelligent citizens admit the right of the government to transport its troops across our soil. It is evident that a portion of the people of Maryland are opposed to the exercise of the right. I have done all in my power to protect the citizens of Maryland and to preserve peace within our borders. Lawless occurrences will be repeated, I fear, unless prompt action be taken by you. It is my duty to advise you of my own convictions, of the proper course to be pursued by Maryland in the emergency which is upon us. It is of no consequence now to discuss the causes which have induced our troubles. Let us look to our distressing present and to our portentous future. The fate of Maryland, and perhaps of her sister border slave states, will undoubtedly be seriously affected by the action of your honorable body. Therefore should every good citizen bend all his energies to the task before us, and therefore should the animosities and bickerings of the past be forgotten, and all strike hands in the bold cause of restoring peace to our state and to our country. I honestly and most earnestly entertain the convention that the only safety of Maryland lies in preserving a neutral position between our brethren of the North and of the South. We have violated no right of either section. we have been loyal to the Union. The unhappy contest between the two sections has not been commenced or encouraged by us, although we have suffered from it in the past. The impending war has not come by any act or any wish of ours. We have done all we could to avert it. We have hoped that Maryland and other border states, by their conservative position and love for the Union, might have acted as mediators between the extremes of both sections, and thus have prevented the terrible evils of a prolonged civil war. Entertaining these views, I cannot counsel Maryland to take sides against the general government until it shall commit outrages on us which would justify us in resisting its authority. As a consequence, I can give no other counsel than that we shall array ourselves for union and peace, and thus preserve our soil from being polluted with the blood of brethren. Thus, if war must be between the North and South, we may force the contending parties to transfer the field of battle from our wall, so that our lives and property may be secure. It seems to me that, independently of all other considerations, our geographical position forces us to this, unless we are willing to see our state the theater of long and bloody civil war, and the consequent utter destruction of every material interest of our people, to say nothing of the blood of brave men and innocent women and children, which will cry out from our soil for vengeance upon us, if we fail to do all that in us lies to avert the impending calamity. The course I suggest has all the while been the sole groundwork of my policy, and but for the excitement prevailing among our people during the past few days, I believe the object I have kept steadily in view during my administration would have been consummated. If it has failed, I have the full consciousness that throughout the whole of my harassing and painful incumbency of the gubernatorial chair, I have labored honestly and faithfully for the peace, the safety, and the interests of Maryland and of our common country. This consciousness has fully sustained me in all my troubles, and has enabled me to endure patiently all the cruel, unmerited, and heartless attacks that have been made upon my integrity. I have also comfort in the conviction that my policy has been sustained by a large majority of the people, and nothing that has transpired since the recent regrettable occurrences within our state has shaken that conviction. A momentary, frantic excitement took the place of reason and good judgment, and men for the time threw aside all prudent thoughts of the future in the burning desire to avenge what they considered wrongs. I submit my suggestions to your wisdom, and I appeal to you not only as devoted citizens of Maryland, but as husbands and fathers, to allow that prudence and Christian-like temper be honorable to all men to guide your counsels, and I implore you not to be swayed by the passions which seem to be so fully aroused in our midst to do what the generations to come after us will ever deplore. In conclusion, gentlemen, I ask your indulgence if I have omitted to present to you any other matter of interest in connection with the important subject which you are summoned to consider. The short time I have had in which to prepare this communication, and the turmoil and excitement around me, may have caused omissions, but if so, they will be promptly supplied when indicated by you. T. Halliday, Hicks, The Valley Spirit, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, May 1st, 1861. From Baltimore. Baltimore, April 26 p.m. The raising of the United States flag in various sections of the city was witnessed by numerous persons. The city authorities say it was done without their authority or sanction. Doubts were expressed as to the earnestness of the information, but the parties who brought the news into the city say they witnessed it themselves. Union demonstration in Maryland. Chambersburg, April the 27th. Passengers from Hagerstown this morning report a sudden and most wonderful change in sentiment in that section of Maryland. The Stars and Stripes were raised in Hagerstown today, and there are extensive preparations for further Union demonstrations. The election next week for representative will result tremendously for Lewis P. Ferry, a Union man. Allegheny County has instructed its representatives that if they vote for secession, they will be hung when they return home. The Stars and Stripes are waving all over Frederick City, and the Home Guard refuse to parade except under its folds and to the tune of Yankee Doodle. At Clear Spring, every house has its flag, and the miners have sworn to resist secession to the death. By next week, no sympathizers with the Southern traders will dare to show their sentiments at Hagerstown, Frederick, or Cumberland. Another passenger reports the eastern shore counties, except Worcester, as Union to the core. The Union men will raise a military company in Hagerstown at once. Maryland. There is no man, no matter what his opinions may be, in reference to the war policy of the present administration, but must feel utterly disgusted with the belligerent attitude Maryland has assumed towards the federal government. It has all the characteristics of genuine plug-uglyism without a single redeeming feature to recommend it. While professing to be in the Union, it undertakes to prevent, and actually attacks, the national troops on their way to the defense of the national capital. This is rebellion in the true sense of the word. We can admire the plucky little state of South Carolina that boldly steps out of the Union and gives timely warning that she is ready to fight and not afraid to commence the battle, but the dastardly conduct of Maryland, while professing friendship and allegiance to the lawful authority of the government, to fall upon her soldiers and butcher the unarmed men like a set of infuriated savages, must leave a stain upon her name that she can never wipe out, no matter whether she stays in the Union or goes out of it. We can feel on this subject, for we have friends whose blood they were exceedingly anxious to shed, and could they have trapped them within the city of Baltimore. That city which the forefathers of these very men marched from this place to defend. We honestly believe that the streets of Baltimore would now be crimsoned with their blood, and that not a man of them would have escaped with his life. It is now a matter of perfect indifference with us whether Maryland secedes or not. One thing, however, is clear, that Pennsylvania owes it to her high character to secede from a state that has shown such an utter disregard for honor, for decency, and for humanity. The contemptible twaddle about the invasion of her soil is beneath the grade of idiocy. She knows very well that the passage of troops across her soil for the defense of the federal capital is not an invasion, and none other but a besotted plug-ugly would utter such language or put in such a plea to justify the murdering of car soldiers. The conduct of Maryland has done more to embitter the North against the South and hasten on the war than any event that has taken place since the breaking up of the Union commenced. But let her go if she has ambitions to.
The Valley Spirit, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, May 1, 1861. From Baltimore. Baltimore, April 26 p.m. The raising of the United States flag in various sections of the city was witnessed by numerous persons. The city authorities say it was done without their authority or sanction. Doubts were expressed as to the earnestness of the information, but the parties who brought the news into the city say they witnessed it themselves. Union demonstration in Maryland, Chambersburg, April 27th. Passengers from Hagerstown this morning report a sudden and most wonderful change in sentiment in that section of Maryland. The Stars and Stripes were raised in Hagerstown today, and there are extensive preparations for further Union demonstrations. The election next week for representative will result tremendously for Lewis P. Ferry, a Union man. Allegheny County has instructed its representatives that if they vote for secession, they will be hung when they return home. The Stars and Stripes are waving all over Frederick City, and the Home Guard refused to parade except under its folds, and to the tune of Yankee Doodle. At Clear Spring, every house has its flag, and the miners have sworn to resist secession to the death. By number.
Well, that's our show for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in, and if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe.